Hello, and welcome to season 2 of the Atlanta Opera's BlinkOpera podcast. I'm Arthur Fagen, music director for the Atlanta Opera, and I'm excited to return to Atlanta to conduct one of the most famous comedies in all of opera, Rossini's Barber of Seville. I fell in love with opera at a very young age. I started studying conducting at the age of 16 with Laszlo Halas, who was the founder of the New York City Opera and its first music director. And he knew the chief usher at the Met. And so every Saturday afternoon, I would be at the Met for their matinee. So I got to hear The Barber of Seville when I was 16, as well as many, many other operas. I began my career at the age of 21 in Frankfurt as an assistant to Christoph Dohnányi at the Frankfurt Opera. Following that, I had numerous conducting positions in Germany, Holland, and Belgium. And I had the great opportunity of conducting so much of the Italian and German operatic repertory. I've conducted over 100 operas in such houses as the Vienna State Opera, the Met, Chicago, Berlin, and many, many other opera houses through the world. I now make my home in Bloomington, Indiana, where I'm a professor at Indiana University, as well as in Atlanta, where I've been music director since 2010. The Barber of Seville is based on the first of three plays, a trilogy written by Beaumarchais. The second one was The Marriage of Figaro, which was written as an opera by Mozart 30 years before The Barber of Seville, and then there was The Guilty Mother. It's amazing that this opera, probably the most popular comedy in all of opera, was written in less than 3 weeks. Rossini was under a deadline. He had been commissioned by the Teatro Argentina in Rome. This was in 1816. And since he didn't have time to write the overture, he stole an overture from two of his previous shows, Aureliano in Palmira and Elisabetta, Regina d'Inghilterra. Now, Elizabeth, Queen of England, is a serious opera. So he used this overture for two comic operas as well as for one serious opera. And he just picked it up and used it for the Barber of Seville. It does not have any of the melodies that are in the opera for that reason, but it has always been a huge success, even for concert going audiences, not only as an overture to the opera. Actually, Rossini called this opera first Alma Viva because he did not want it confused with Paisiello's Barber of Seville. And that was a sign of respect to Paisiello. And how was this respect returned? Paisiello sent all his supporters and sycophants to the opening of Barber of Seville so that they could boo and hiss the opera, so that Rossini's first performance would be a complete failure. Many of our most beloved operas today, like Carmen or Madame Butterfly, were complete failures at their first performances. You often hear a work that might have been a public failure or a failure with the critics, and somehow these works survive the test of time and they become known as some of the greatest masterpieces of this genre. The same idea of ornamentation that existed at the time of Handel was carried on into the bel canto era. Those of you who listened to Gary Guido's podcast on Julius Caesar, you might have learned a little bit about that in the da capo sections, which are repeat sections of arias. It was normal for singers to improvise embellishments and cadenzas and ornamentation. The same thing applies to Rossini, although the style is quite different. The intent at that time was to have it improvised at the moment by the artist singing, just as a jazz singer would improvise on a song today. So you never hear the aria the same way twice. Nowadays, most singers come with a canned version of the ornamentation. They learn a specific set of ornamentation and they don't generally veer from it. I had the unusual experience recording a CD of Rossini with two very well known Rossini singers, Vesselina Kasarova and Juan Diego Flores. Kasarova was so immersed in the Rossini style that she could improvise a different cadenza and different ornamentation on every take. You know, when we record, you will take each passage and you will do it 5 or 6 times. So if you're lucky, you may do it only twice. Every particular take of a passage, she would improvise different cadenzas and different ornamentation, and I found that quite remarkable. Rossini was a remarkably prolific composer. He wrote something like 40 operas in a span of 20 years between 1810 and 1830, and actually retired at that point and lived for almost another 40 years. This is quite remarkable. When one improvises, one has to demonstrate what we would call good taste, which means not imposing so much ornamentation or embellishment that the aria becomes unrecognizable. There's a famous anecdote about Adelina Patti, one of the most celebrated divas of the time, who came to Rossini to sing for him. And she sang the aria of Rosina from the Barber of Seville, Una voce poco fa, with such florid ornamentation that after she was done, Rossini said to her, "Oh, that was lovely, my dear. Who wrote that?" Now, I would like to share with you 3 of my favorite moments from the opera and tell you a bit more about Rossini's compositional style. Rossini's comic operas are characterized by 2 quite different styles of the period. One is the opera buffo style, and the other is the bel canto style. The bel canto style is a style of what we would call very lyrical, beautiful singing that was also used by Donizetti and Bellini and even went on into a later period with Verdi. The buffo style is something that was developed in Naples in the late 1700s and usually involves 2 romantic figures and 2 comic figures. And the buffo style of singing is generally very fast, non-lyrical singing, where you often have an incredibly fast pattern. In the first excerpt that we're going to play for you today, which is the part of the aria of Don Bartolo, Bartolo has become incredibly upset with his ward, Rosina, who he hopes to marry, because he senses her flirtation with the Count Almaviva, who's disguised now as a poor student named Lindoro. And when he takes off in the second part of the aria, which you'll hear now, I think you'll have a quick understanding of what buffo style is.
Signorino, un'altra volta quando battro al fuori. Signorino, un'altra volta quando battro al fuori. La consiglia se ritorna a suo modo fa saprà. Signorino, un'altra volta quando battro al fuori. Signorino, un'altra volta quando battro al fuori. La consiglia se ritorna a suo modo fa saprà. Che non servono le smorfie, faccia pure la catamorta, faccia pure la catamorta. Cospetto per quella porta, limellaria, la porta. Cospetto per quella porta, limellaria, la porta.
Now that you've heard an example of opera buffo, let's hear an example of bel canto style. Just before the trio of the second act of Barber of Seville begins, Almaviva has revealed his true self to Rosina. She is overjoyed that she has not been deceived and sings in bel canto style, "Ah, quel colpo inaspettato." What unexpected moment. For the final excerpt on today's program, I'd like to share with you the finale from Act 1 of The Barber of Seville, which demonstrates Rossini's incredible compositional genius. The first act of every comic Rossini opera climaxes with a frenzy of chaos and lunacy. It's over the top, a whirlwind of notes and fast passages. Thank you all for joining me on the Atlanta Opera podcast, BlinkOpera. I'm Arthur Fagen, music director at the Atlanta Opera and conductor for our upcoming production of The Barber of Seville. I hope you've enjoyed learning more about Rossini and his musical brilliance.